All right, everyone, welcome to part 2 of the 6-hour Sociocracy workshop hosted through the Design School for Regenerating Earth. And I'm your instructor, Andrea, today. And we're going to start with a little grounding practice. So if you want to find a comfortable position and start paying a little more attention to your body, taking some deeper breaths, maybe closing your eyes or lowering your gaze, and just presencing the breath. Mm. And understanding that as above, so below, talk a lot about organizations and groups, but your body is also an organization of groups and cells and organs, bones and muscle, and thoughts. Thoughts that might belong to various systems of the brain that even might be in conflict with each other sometimes, and that's okay. So in the spaciousness of paying attention to your breathing, just inviting anything that feels like it wants to be heard right now. Maybe there's a sensation in your body that's a little louder than usual. Maybe there's a persistent thought. Just letting it in this moment, giving it a little bit of space. What does it need from you? Is there anything in this moment that would help that voice or that sensation feel a little bit safer or more open? And if they can't be soothed, that's okay. There's no need to pressure it, just noticing, continuing to develop that relationship to your inner world. And returning to your breath, knowing that you can come back to this inner space, this inner listening at any time. And as you feel ready, you can open your eyes and return to this outer group space. All right, welcome everybody. So as we get some folks lined up to take comments about things that you remember from last time, things that you've been sitting with, maybe some things that surprised you, just a little bit of a popcorn review here, you can raise your hand. And we'll get a little bit of a lineup. But as we're doing that, I do just want to mention, especially since we have a few new folks who might not have watched the first recording yet, that governance can be a really loaded topic sometimes. So just paying attention to how your nervous system is feeling as we're moving through this content and taking breaks if you need, taking deep breaths. Hopefully it won't get too heated, but just so that you're paying attention to your body and your own nervous system. And then it is possible that people might bring up real world examples from their own organizations or from their own group spaces. And so just being mindful of confidentiality in that if you want to take some of these stories to someone or a group outside of this class, just make sure that you're anonymizing the content. So that is the ask here. So yeah, are there any shares that people would like to say about some things that they learned from last time, some things that were really helpful or really interesting, or any other feedback from the last session? Go ahead and raise the hand. Yeah, Michelle.
So this is probably more of a metaphor than an exact replica. But I was away for a weekend with a group from our canoe and kayak club, which In Canada, you don't canoe and kayak at this time of year because there's a lot of ice. But the metaphorical thing was someone went out on snowshoes and there's this lookout point and it's the trail was markers were buried under snow and it was really thick snow, like you're sinking 2.5 feet into snow with snowshoes on. So she went up halfway and then she turned back and she was disappointed and some other people met her on the way down, and so that track got in, and then my husband and I went a little further. Apparently we went off the trail, and then a third person went, and finally the fourth group got to the lookout point. So it was kind of like a metaphor for it. It doesn't seem like you're making progress, and we weren't the people who got to the lookout point, but we know other people did. So yeah, it was kind of a cool metaphor.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, little bits at a time, but it makes a difference. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, and just to jog our memories of some things that we talked about last time, we talked about consent in decision making and what it means to look for a shared range of tolerance. We talked about conversational rounds and we talked about different types of agenda options. So there's the report back where you're just asking for questions about something that already happened. There's the explore. So that's when you're doing questions and comments. You're kind of doing some collective brainstorming together. And then you have the decision, which is the question, comments, and the consent and objection round. So yeah, anything that jog anyone's memory about things that are coming up for them or reflections they had after our last session? I know it was a week ago and a lot's happened in the world, but raise a hand if you're feeling like reflecting. Maria?
Yeah, I'll share because we in our core team have been able to practice applying sociocracy in two different meetings with two different circles, actually. And it was super interesting because both Florence and I were in both meetings, but nobody else had been trained. And we just took a few minutes up front, maybe 10 minutes, to explain a few core principles that we learned last time and practices. It didn't take long at all. And then we applied it. And it was amazing. I mean, it wasn't perfect, obviously. It takes practice, but the impact was amazing. We already saw very positive results, and the feedback was amazing as well. So I just want to recognize that. I appreciate it, and thank you very much. We're so grateful. Can't wait to learn more.
Hey, that's really great feedback. I'm so glad you're getting some real world practice. Two meetings already. That's impressive. Yeah, great. And over to you, Randy.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just wanted to acknowledge as well the utility of even the basics that we've learned so far. I mean, my experience working in circles like this one is we have people who are very conscious, who have subscribed to a set of principles, a way of relating to the world, so on, et cetera. And there's just such a vast um, difference between embracing this way of thinking, acknowledging its relevance, believing in its utility, and attempting to practice it or bring it to others versus fully embodying it ourselves. And I think often when we get into interpersonal dynamics, when we're faced with reacting based on our own cumulative traumas, the reality is we have our blind spots and we show up in ways that are totally not aligned or misaligned or in conflict with the ways that we think that we'd like to show up, etc. So having tools, solutions, ways of orienting ourselves that help us to further align and get past our own crap, for lack of a better word, is just super valuable, right? I think like an innovation like this, a unique approach like this is something that everyone can appreciate the value of, and it just gives us a place to look when we run into challenges or conflict, whether it's because of one person or another, just some way of navigating together that ensures that we stay closer to the straight and narrow that I think we all hope we find ourselves on.
Yeah, that's a really good reflection. Thank you so much. Yeah. It's nice to have something to fall back on. Like, I don't know if you remember that slide about like group cohesion and how, structure helps you get there, values help you get there, skills help you get there. So having the structure to fall back on a little bit when things are not feeling very cohered, it can be really helpful. So yeah. Very good. Yeah, I've heard someone say that there really aren't bad people, there are bad systems. It's like if you create a good system and then you put people in it, they tend to use it, they tend to like it. So, and especially a system that responds to feedback. We've talked a lot about feedback so far, but a system that responds to feedback is going to iterate over time and become better suited to the group that's using it. So that's a really beautiful thing too. Maybe one more reflection before we move on? Anyone else want to say anything about something they learned or how they applied it or things they're curious about? Penny?
So we're starting up a new organization and it's going to be a 501(c)(3), and we had our first board meeting and we decided to put in the bylaws that we're going to use sociocracy for decision making in the board. And so we actually did some rounds and voted and did the whole thing, and I showed some of your slides, in the in the meeting to overview of what sociocracy is and what the rounds are and consent, and it worked really well. So yeah, we're excited to be implementing it.
Oh, that's super, super exciting. Oh my gosh. Okay, great. Thank you. Now I'm gonna try to stop smiling. Okay, great. Thank you for that share. That makes me really happy. All right. And yes, I can share the slides here. Let's see. So this has all the slides in them, so you'll have to skip to part 2 if you're following along, but I will share my screen also here in just a moment. Okay. Thank you for those reflections. These are all really lovely, and I'm super excited to dive into today's content, go a little bit deeper. All right, and I'm sharing my screen. Yep, so as I mentioned, just a little review of part 1. We talked about consent, conversational rounds, type of agenda items, and just again, kind of giving you this idea of how the agenda topics work. So if someone's just giving a report, something happened, we did an event, how did it go? Then you just have that report, that initial introduction, and then a question round. Otherwise, you might be brainstorming something, you might be looking for feedback from your group. So in that case, you're going to do the report or the introduction of the topic. What is the plan so far? What would you like to talk about? And then that exploration reaction round. So you have the question round, reaction round. And then if you're making a decision, you introduce the topic, you do questions, you do the reaction round, you do the consent round. And that's also where objections come in, is that consent round. So let's just review there. And today we're going to look at integrating objections. So, okay, great. We know how to do rounds now, but what happens if someone objects? How do we handle that? And how do we handle that in a way that is graceful and builds social cohesion and instead of division? We're going to talk about agenda structures, types of meeting roles and how you select them. And then we'll dig a little bit deeper into meeting feedback and other types of feedback in the sociocratic process, as that is one of the core pillars of sociocracy. So I'm going to jump right in with talking about integrating objections. So you have your facilitator, and the facilitator is talking about keeping us on track. They're following the agenda and they are facilitating the rounds of conversation. But when an objection occurs, it is not the facilitator's responsibility to resolve the objection. It's also not the objector's responsibility to resolve the objection. It is the whole group's responsibility to resolve the objection. And so it is a gift when someone objects. I think I've said that before, but really just reiterating that. It's saying to the group, not necessarily that like, hey, I actually prefer this other thing. That's a personal preference. But instead, an objection is actually saying, hey, I don't think this is good enough. I don't think this is safe enough to try. I think that this might actually counteract the goal or the aim of our group. And so that's a pretty that's pretty heavy. That's that's a big objection, and objections are serious. Objections should be treated with care and welcomed into the space because they bring diversity of perspective. So there are some ways that you can work with the objection in the moment. So you often do a round. I actually might have a slide on this. Yeah. So you're doing the understanding. So this is the question round. Then you do the reaction round, and then you're in the decision phase where you're deciding whether you consent or object. And if there is an objection, you actually kind of repeat this process. So you go around and do a round of questions about like, does everyone understand why this objection is here? Do we all understand that? And then you do a round of amendments or reactions essentially to that objection. Like, does anyone have ideas about how we could resolve this objection? And then you create a new proposal and do another consent round to see if you've resolved the objection. So this can create more time in the meeting. So if your topic is maybe 10 minutes and you really only planned for 10 minutes, you might not be able to do this process in the same meeting. You might need to table it. Another thing that you can do is you can create a subcommittee to kind of go through this process and bring a new proposal to the next meeting. It is helpful to have the person who introduced the topic, who came with the proposal initially, and the objector on that subcommittee so they can work together to figure out how to resolve that issue. But ideally, you do resolve this in the meeting so that you can still come to a decision. And I'm going to go back to this slide. So some of the things that you can do is you can modify the proposal. So maybe someone's saying, to bring back our breakfast example, well, I mean, I like oatmeal and I like fruit, but I would really prefer if we also had some milk and toast. So we can modify the proposal. We can make breakfast more appealing to whoever is uncomfortable with what we chose. We could also shorten the term. So we could say, maybe let's try doing, if we're going to do a monthly breakfast, let's try doing this monthly breakfast this way for 3 months instead of 6 months. And we'll kind of review it at 3 months and we'll see if it's working and we can change it at that point. So that's one way that you can potentially absolve the problem, the objection. Or you could measure the concern. So in that way, it's, someone says, there's a lot of liability about this event that we want to put on. Is there a way that we can go and get some metrics about the actual safety concern or, the liability or how that would work? So can we just get some more information about that? Or can we try this and review the data after the fact and decide if that was a good idea? So those are potential items that can help people feel heard in their objection and can integrate that so that the group can still come to a decision. Because ideally, we're not saying, oh, there's an objection, we're going to throw this proposal out. We're trying to figure out what makes this safe enough to try. What makes this an experiment that we're willing to do for maybe a shorter period of time? So I am going to, gotta change the sound here. Give me just a moment, but I have a little video for you of how this might work in practice so you can see how that goes. So just pay attention to maybe some of the roles that are happening, who's facilitating, how they're moving through the rounds, and notice that there's not one but two objections. And so just noticing how those are showing up and how they're dealt with in the group.
And Michael has a request from our finance.
Yeah, so after a lot of discussion about the stipends and how they kind of cycle from year to year, I've worked with finance to have this proposal that stipends cannot be carried over into the new fiscal year. This will make it easier to budget so that there's not as much paperwork trying to have things float from year to year. And it'll also motivate people to use them because we've kind of been seeing on our side that we give people this money and then it just kind of sits there year after year, and so they're not actually doing training. And we think that we want to kind of see how this goes over time, so we're suggesting a term of 3 years.
Great, thanks, Michael. Let's do a question round, and we'll go Lizzie, then I'll go Luciano, and then Adam. Lizzie?
No questions from me.
I don't have any questions either. Luciano?
What I do have a question, Michael. I would like to understand, like, grasp the complexity that this decision will imply or reduce for finance.
Would you like me to answer that now or at the end, Elon?
We can go ahead and wait till the end. Adam, do you have any questions?
No questions from me.
Go ahead, Michael.
Sure. Yeah, I think to your question, so like right now it's difficult for finance to do the budget year over year because when they're trying to like close out the budget, it's kind of like they have to transfer the expenses for the stipend from one year that we're holding and they have to transfer it to the next year. So there's kind of a lot of carryover and it's hard to estimate how many people will actually end up using that money since it never expires. So it's actually becoming a bit of a headache for them.
All right, thanks, Michael. Well, let's go ahead and do a reaction round then. We'll go same order, Lizzie, me, Luciano, Adam, and then Michael. Go ahead, Lizzie.
Yeah, it sounds good to me, especially if people aren't using things and we want them to use it, right? So yeah, check.
Yeah, I know budget reconciliation can be kind of hairy at the end of the year. And so I get where they're coming from. Check. Luciano, reaction?
Well, I'm a bit puzzled, I would say, because I don't see this big advantage. And on top of that, I don't see it as a motivation for people to spend more money. That's a bit my feeling. Check.
Thank you. Adam?
Yeah, I'm actually the opposite. I feel like people, if they see the deadline coming up, they're going to spend the money on just whatever they want because they're not going to have it next year. And I think that could be a mistake. I think it might lead to people using more money than they usually do. And 3 years is a really long time. I'd like to see a sort of recap in a year. I think 3 years is much too long. Check.
Thanks, Adam. Michael, reactions?
Yeah, I kind of understand what I'm hearing. I mean, I appreciate on some sides that we do see the deadline as motivating. I think that was our idea. I think that with the idea of like people taking nonsense classes, I think we do kind of limit what classes people can take. So we know that there will be some value in them.
Thanks, Michael. Well, let's go ahead and go through a consent round. We'll keep the same order. Lizzie?
Yeah, I consent.
I do as well. Luciano?
I object.
And Adam?
Yeah, I'm going to object as well.
Okay. And Michael?
I consent.
All right, well, let's take a look at what those objections are. So, Luciano, would you like to share a little bit more about your objection?
Yeah, thank you. Partially, I said before. I want to add a couple of things. My fear is that people will spend at the end of the year just pointless courses like nonsense classes just to spend money, and that's a kind of I don't find it really effective and meaningful. And the second issue is that in some cases there are some courses that are not taken, like they don't happen every year. I mean, I see it this year for next year, for example, in February next year, I'm in October, for example, and then I would just waste that year, the money for that year. It's a bit of a, I think it requires some planning, also organizing those courses, and having it just 1 year time, it's not the most effective way to do it. Check.
Thanks, Luciano. Adam, would you clarify your objection a bit too as well?
Sorry, could you repeat that last part, Luciano? I didn't hear it.
The point, my second point is that we need a kind of a regularity and planning capacity to plan training, right? In some cases, the course is next year, and if you have to spend it this year, we won't be able to do it, and sometimes, it's like it requires like more money I want to bring some money from this year to next one, it happens, and I think it's an issue.
I see.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah. So my objection was that people are going to use up their money, and I think one way I'd be sort of willing to shift a little bit is if we tracked whether people were using their money at the end of the year just to use it, or if all the budget is in November and December, then we might have a problem. But otherwise, and the term as well, I like 1 year. That's what I'd be willing to concede to consent. Check.
All right, thanks, Adam. So we've got concerns over people being pressured to use money then, and potentially just using the money because they've got it and need to use it, as well as concerns around the term and whatnot. I know Adam mentioned that a modification might be to really take a look and measure who's taking classes when and what kind of classes they're taking, and possibly to shorten the term. Are there any other ideas on how we could modify this proposal to make it more something that we can all consent to? Lizzie?
Yeah, I think that because we really want to make sure that people are using it to the best of their ability. So I feel like people should maybe have to request to have the money moved over, and like maybe we set a deadline so that we're not just kind of carrying it over. Like they have to request it, and we have to kind of create some kind of system about the old money that they haven't used. And so I feel like there's some space there to actually request for classes in the previous year to kind of move over, or just some things that we're not losing out on it, I think could really help.
Gotcha, thank you. So I think a new proposal could be that if you wanted to be able to carry your money over each year, that you would have to request that specifically from finance at a certain point in time. And maybe we can ask finance what that time period might need to look like, as well as really taking a look at whether the issue of people using the money at the last minute on nonsense classes is a real concern, and that we will also then shorten the term to a year instead of 3 years. Let's go ahead and do a consent round, and we'll go same order. Lizzie?
Consent.
Myself as well. Luciano?
Consent.
Adam?
Me too.
And Michael?
I consent.
Okay. So I'm just curious about folks that have reflections about that. You can raise your hand. And as we're waiting for kind of a lineup here, I just want to say a couple things about that. So in the part where they ask for suggestions and ideas for modifying the proposal, they didn't do a full round there. I think a full round might be helpful. You can just raise hands at that point. But the more that you move away from the rounds, the more likely there is to bring tension back into the space. So if you just continue in the rounds, that can be really helpful to prevent it from getting heated or prevent tension from coming into the room. And also the rounds as a facilitator are a really good way to just keep moving through the room. And if you've abandoned the rounds, it can be difficult to come back to them because there's not that structure in place, even meeting to meeting or round to round. So just noting that. And then the other thing I wanted to note is that the facilitator, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the facilitator is not necessarily coming up with the modified proposal, but they are restating it for the group. So that's kind of what the facilitator was doing is, hey, here's what I'm hearing. I'm trying to synthesize it for everybody so that we can still come to a decision together. So that was kind of what was going on there. I just wanted to name those things. What questions or reflections do you have from that little video that we watched? Or do you have any edge cases about objections you can think of that you want to talk through? And we'll go to Dave.
One thing that came up for me towards the beginning, I think it was Luciano asked a question and then it was answered. One thing I tend to do personally for clarification with people is to add, like, did that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
I asked it, but I didn't notice. Maybe I just missed it. I didn't notice that happening. So I don't know if that's a thing that happens. I'd be curious to learn more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I've heard most facilitators will say, like, do you have any other questions or did that answer your question? And it really just depends on the facilitator. Like there is a lot of variance around how people facilitate, and it just kind of depends. That's the kind of a skill that people pick up over time too. So yeah, thanks for reminding us of that. And it's always good to check that that completed the question or the comment. So yeah, thank you. And Michelle.
So I think, and you're probably going to go on for this later, but the facilitator didn't have any questions or objections herself, right? And I imagine that you'd either have to have a different kind of process or a different way of doing it if it was the facilitator who, or maybe just a way of doing it, but it did make it easier to go around the fact that it wasn't her objection. That's kind of what I noted.
Yeah, that can be really challenging to facilitate your own objection, but people do it. And the way that they do it is they'll just say like, okay, facilitator hat off for a second. I'm feeling this. Like, as a member of this circle, I feel some concern about this proposal, right? And then they'll say, okay, facilitator hat back on. Let's do a round, right? So that's kind of like where that comes in is you'll kind of take your hat on and take your hat off. And as a facilitator, you have to be really aware of that. And then I think as a facilitator, you also have to really monitor your own tension and your own nervous system. Because if you're getting heated about your own objection, then everyone else in the room is going to match your energy. So yeah, as a facilitator, that's definitely something to keep an eye on. But yeah, it's really important for the facilitator to also do the rounds. They're also going to give their comments. They're also going to give their consent or their objection. They are still a member of the circle, even though they're facilitating the circle. And that's also why it's good for that role to rotate. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but I would suggest that you rotate at least once a year, and I wouldn't rotate sooner than 3 months. This 3 months gives the facilitator time to practice and get comfortable with the role, and that allows for some continuity. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't link the slides. Hang on real quick. Or I did. Okay, maybe I will repost. Here's that. Hopefully that works. Let me know if it doesn't. But yeah, so having that term can help to rotate that role so that everyone still gets a chance to be a full participating member of the circle and not having to monitor the energy all the time. So, and over to Maria Elena.
Yeah, so I noticed that you said it's the facilitator that restates the new proposal, and I'm just wondering why that is, and could it be the person that put forward the proposal in the first place? Or is there a reason why it's not them?
Yeah, I think there's some thought around the person who brings the proposal having a little bit more attachment to the original proposal. So I think the spaciousness with the facilitator restating it can help that person be a little more objective about the changes. But I think it can be the original proposal if that makes sense. But I think that the facilitator's role in the meeting is really to do that synthesizing work. And so that it's usually just defaults to the facilitator. But yeah, that's a good question. Mm-hmm. And Dave, did you have another? You're muted, Dave.
I misclicked. Thank you. Yeah, something else came up for me. I noticed notes were being taken as well. And is that a separate person from the facilitator? And if it is, and the facilitator is synthesizing, and there's also the note taker, how often does that diverge, and how do you resolve that?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that next. So I will save that question for then, and that should become clear. Okay, we'll have another chance to ask some questions after our next set of slides. So I think I'll go ahead and move on. Make sure we're staying on, or I guess we have time if anyone else has a question or reflection at this stage, specifically about objections. I will say one more thing that at least in the Pacific Northwest, we're all very nice We're all very kind, and sometimes that means that we're afraid of conflict. And so we can be a little avoidant. And so I've noticed that we try, like there's a temptation to try to resolve objections in the reaction round before we even get to the consent round. And it can actually be really helpful to still go through the consent and have the objection and have that full space to ask questions and do another reaction round about the objection specifically, rather than the facilitator trying to, oh, I got to solve this problem right now or else there's going to be conflict. Like it's okay. Objections are okay. They're good. They're actually a sign that people feel safe enough to bring up concerns. And so if you're in a meeting and it's been a year and you've never had an objection, you might like start to get curious about like, do people feel safe enough to bring this up? So I just it's also kind of a barometer of how safe do we feel together. And I just want to encourage people to be brave in that and try to cultivate an environment where objections are welcome and frequent. So yeah. Okay, let's move on. I'll share my screen again. All right. So I want to spend a little bit of time before I dive into the roles in a meeting. I want to talk about the agenda structure because this is important to the roles. So the agenda structure in Sociocracy, this is kind of the one that I use. I typically have three sections of the meeting. So you have your sort of like upfront matter. So your check-ins, your report back, sometimes your action item review, announcements, consent to the agenda, that never changes. That's always going to be that way. So, you just know that at the beginning of your meeting, you're going to spend 15 to 20 minutes just covering all of that admin stuff, right? Maybe that's like, how much money do we have in the bank account? Whatever it is, just build it into your agenda. This is how much time it's allotted. That's what we're going to do. And then you have sort of the second section is the actual rotating meeting topics. So these are different every time. This is like the meat of your meeting. This is why we're here. This is what we need to talk about. This is the most relevant, most urgent things that we need to talk about. So that's that front middle section. So that's like your report backs, your explorations, and your proposals. And then you have your your checkout section. So you have your backlog review, you have action item read back, new action items that were developed, and then your meeting feedback. And I just really want to say, I've said this last time, but do try really hard not to skimp on that meeting feedback because that's really what is going to build that social cohesion. You get feedback about your facilitation, the group gets feedback about how is this going, how can we improve, and that's really important. You might not need 10 minutes, it might be like 5 minutes. These are just kind of, the times are approximate. And then just notice that a report back is going to be less time, exploration is going to be a little more time, and then the proposals usually you want to allot a little extra time because you might have objections come up. And if you can save some time on your agenda and you have extra time, then you can go into your backlog, which should be right there on the agenda, ready to go with who's proposing, how much time it's going to take and what the topic is, and you can slate it right in really easy. So this is kind of this agenda structure that I use and that is typical in Sociocracy. And yeah, I find it to be really helpful. And there's also templates on Sociocracy for All that you can use for your agenda. And I have some templates too. If you ask, I might post them on the space in the school. So talking about meeting roles. So in a meeting, there are usually in an organization that's fully implemented Sociocracy, there are 4 roles in every circle. So the one that you're most familiar with that you've all seen a lot at this point in the 2 videos that we've watched is the facilitator role. So they're the person who's facilitating their rounds, they're watching the energy of the group, they're restating proposals, and they're keeping everybody on task. They're watching out for tension that's coming up, they're helping people return to the rounds, they're calling on people, they're keeping track of what's happening at the meeting. That's their role. At the meeting, they're facilitating. They might also lead a grounding. They run the check-in and check-out process. Like that's what they do. That's the facilitator role. And as Dave mentioned, there's someone keeping notes. So that is the secretary. The secretary also typically drafts the agenda ahead of the meeting, usually about a week before the meeting. Ideally, they'll draft the agenda. This happens so members of the group can always submit proposals or suggestions for the agenda, and the secretary compiles them, prioritizes them, and sends them to the navigator sort of for approval. Or like initial approval. The secretary is also keeping track of the backlog. So for anything that is too much for that meeting that can be deprioritized for the next meeting, then they'll put it in the backlog and they'll make sure that the agenda item has someone to propose it, how much time it's going to take, and what the topic is. They're also going to take notes during the meeting, and they'll typically keep time for the meeting. So just make sure that, okay, there's only 15 minutes allotted for this. We've already gone through 10 minutes, just so you know. So kind of keeping time. And the facilitator can also keep time. Timekeeping can be designated wherever, but it should be designated somewhere. I do also want to say that it's possible for the same person in the circle to hold multiple roles, but it's ideal to spread them out as much as you can. It just helps with the lift and the load. And I see the question, Liz, and I will come back to you after I finish this slide. To Dave's point, with the note taking, if there's a difference between what's in the notes and what the facilitators say restates, usually, especially with meeting minutes, they get sent out to everybody to approve after the meeting. Just like, hey, here, just check and make sure all of this is correct. Go through, make sure like you were documented as saying what you actually said, or you can change it. So there's usually an opportunity after the meeting for everyone to review the notes and make changes as needed. And so the navigator, or sometimes in sociocracy, it's called the leader of the circle. This person is responsible for ensuring that the circle is continuing to work toward its aim or its goal. They're responsible for the circle review processes. They're the one who approves the agenda. They can also help the secretary think through the priority of agenda items. Like, is this something that could wait till next time, or do we need to do this now? And then they're acting as one of two links to report back decisions to other circles. So we'll talk more about that at this session, our third session. But just kind of knowing that they're the ones offering report backs to other circles. That's part of the communication in the circle organization if you have more than one circle. If you don't have more than one circle, then they're just kind of keeping an eye on like, hey, are we moving forward? Are we doing regular reviews, or do we have meeting feedback? And they're kind of there. You wouldn't know that someone is a navigator or a leader in a circle just by watching a meeting, right? Like they're gonna be there. They're just paying attention. They're kind of the big picture person, right? They're not facilitating the meeting. They're just keeping an eye on the big picture, making sure we're moving along. And then the delegate is really only relevant if you have multiple circles in your organization, but they're the double link. They're the second link in the communication process. So that's a person who's going to go to the circle above them, maybe the parent circle or the general circle or the coordination circle, and tell them the decisions that got made. So ideally, you have two people who are going to link to those upper circles, or the parent circle, so that there's active communication and you're not relying on one single person who potentially has bias, potentially didn't record notes on particular things to share that information. There's two people who are there with the priorities of that particular circle in mind, who can communicate to that circle and then bring whatever decisions were made at that other circle back to the circle that they actually are holding a role in. So, right, I think our next slide is a question slide. Nope. Okay. I will pause and we can do some questions about the roles. Liz, did you still have a question? Okay, I'm going to go to Julie, but Liz, if you still have a question, let me know. Julie, did you have a question?
I'm afraid I'll forget the words. Could you put the slide back?
Yeah, I can do that.
I guess I don't know what come on, blackness. Come on. There we go. What the navigator responsible for review processes is.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about this later in the session, but essentially there are multiple types of review processes. So there's the meeting feedback, which the facilitator facilitates. There's individual performance reviews. So especially as someone is ending the term on their role. So let's say that the facilitator's term is a year and their term is up, then the navigator would be responsible for noticing like, okay, your term is up and let's do a review of how that went. What went really well? What didn't go so well? And that will be facilitated through like with the circle. So that's a circle process. So that might be something that the navigator's like, oh, it's time to reselect for the facilitator. Let's make sure that we get a performance review on the agenda and go through that performance review process, which the facilitator can still facilitate, but the navigator just makes sure it gets on the agenda and they're kind of keeping tabs on when that happens. And then there's also a circle review process. So on some cadence, we review how are we functioning as a circle? How are we doing? What could we do better? So there's that meta level review. So the review processes are just something that the navigator's kind of keeping tabs on and putting in the agenda when it's time.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Any other questions or reflections on the meeting roles? I do want to say I don't know that I have a slide on this. Let me see. Yeah, I don't. There's another type of role that isn't a meeting role. It's called a operational role. So that might be, maybe you have a finance circle and you have someone who's in charge of the budget. So their role is you draft the budget. And that role, that operational role can double up with a meeting role. So maybe you're the delegate, but you're also the budget drafter. That can happen where you have an operational role and a meeting role. But I really, again, like if you had 5 people in the circle, all of them ideally would have a role. So everyone feels like they have some responsibility in the circle. They're participating in some way. The more you double up roles, the less people feel like they're actively participating. But if you don't have enough people to hold all the roles, then people can hold multiple roles, and that's okay. That you might need an expert. You might be working in a regeneration circle or something, and you might need an expert in permaculture. So you might design your circle so that you always have someone holding that permaculture expert role so that you know that there's someone there to advise on the type of regeneration work you're doing so that you're getting that feedback in those comment rounds. You know that someone is holding that role and you're selecting for that role so that's held in the circle. And ideally the people might change in the circle, but the roles typically stay the same. So if the permaculture expert leaves the circle, you need a new permaculture expert, right? Okay. And Michelle, did you have a question or reflection?
Yeah, I think I was thinking a little bit about whether it would be up to the navigator. Supposing you have maybe you could have someone who doesn't have enough confidence, or someone who perhaps has more confidence than skill, whatever, and they're not doing, like, there's a true performance issue in how they're doing that does the navigator kind of watch and talk to them privately, or would the navigator kind of take on a mentor role if they're skipping rounds, or how, because you could see if someone really had a lot of trouble, all of a sudden it's as if they're under constant supervision. So I just wondered, especially as you're getting used to things, people may not have the skill level to which they will ultimately be able to do.
Yeah, that's a great question. So often if you know that you're selecting a facilitator who doesn't necessarily have very much experience, then you might keep their term kind of short so that they're getting some practice and we can just see how it goes. So that means that maybe at the end of that 3-month period, you have a full review process where you can tell them, here's some things that are going well, here's some things to maybe work on, here's some resources, here's some training that I know about that you could go and do. And if that feels like too much for that facilitator, then at that point they could say, you know what, I think I'm going to opt out of this role at this time. Maybe I'll come back to it in the future. I got some practice. So that's one way that you could handle that. Another way that you could handle that is at the meeting feedback at the end of every meeting. There's some time to say like, hey, this this didn't quite work for me. I really liked the way you did this, but this part of it was a real struggle for me. And so I think it's really good when you can have the opportunity to share that with the whole group so that the whole group can see that there's maybe a little bit of a friction point or a tension point. Ideally in sociocracy, nothing's coming out of the blue. You're doing this regular meeting feedback so that everyone's kind of noticing like, oh, that did kind of not quite feel right. And maybe let's talk about how we could do that better in the future. And if you have a really new facilitator, then yeah, having someone that they can go to as a mentor would be good. It might be good to have that person be outside of the circle. So especially if you have multiple circles, maybe you have a community council circle, or maybe you have a governance circle, or maybe you even have a training circle and you have someone sort of linked up with a new facilitator so that there's not tension within the same circle about who's keeping tabs and who's in a mentor relationship and those kinds of things. And everyone could stay on that peer level together. So those are a couple ideas on how to navigate that. And I heard a comment in the chat of trying to speak slower. So I will heard that feedback. Thank you for sharing it. And I will work on that as well. I get excited about this. So thanks for the feedback. That's really helpful for me. Okay, let's see. Where are we at here? All right, we're going to do our selection process. So we're going to get a little bit of experience in selecting a role. So I'll show you how that works in Sociocracy. So oops, I got to share my screen here. Come on. So you need to figure out what the role is that someone's going to be doing. So with the meeting roles, that's already pretty straightforward and lined out for you. But like I said, you might need an expert role at some point. So you really need to detail what is the role that person will be doing. What do they have purview over? What can they make decisions about without the group's input? And is this a paid role? So these are some questions that help outline what the role is. What is then you need to decide what the term of that role is. How long will they serve? When will they have a group review process? And then the qualifications. What qualifications are necessary to succeed in this role? What sort of things do we need as a group for this to work well? So this is something that you might also do in rounds with your group. And then once that role is established, then you can carry that forward. And even the role itself can go through a review process if people are like, this role isn't working. You can do that as well. So that's kind of what would lead up to the role selection process. And then the actual process itself, this happens in a meeting. You're going to do a round. So everyone, you propose the role, right? So the role is to be the navigator of the circle. They're the big picture person. They have these responsibilities. They're going to send the approved agenda out to the whole circle, right? You have some clear delineations of how that happens. And then you do a round of nominations. So everyone gets a chance to nominate someone that they think would do a good job in that role and say why. And the why is really important because it helps give feedback to that person immediately, right? So I think that, so-and-so would be a really good secretary because I really appreciate how detail oriented they are, and their notes are very clear and very understandable. So that person who just got nominated, they might not end up being the secretary, but they got that feedback of like, wow, people think that I'm good at this thing. That's great. And so that actually helps build that social cohesion overall. And then it also helps for the change round. So as we're going through and the facilitator or the note taker, probably the note taker, is going through and tallying up who's getting nominated. And then whoever gets, so they're tallying up who gets nominated. And then before we sort of say who the running candidate is, we do a change round. So we ask everyone, we go in, in order in a round. Having heard what people have said about, various people in the circle, do you want to change your nomination? Is that something you want to do? So you have an opportunity based on what the group said. Do you want to change your nomination? And then at that point, whoever has the most nominations gets the opportunity to consent to that role. Is this something that you have time for? Is this something you even want to do? And, depending on whether they say yes or no, if they say yes, then the whole group does a consent round. Does everyone consent to this person holding this role for this term? And if If the person does not consent to holding the role, then you go to the person who has the second most nominations for that role. So you might select multiple roles in the same meeting, but I would caution just to have some balance in, maybe trying to break up how many selections you're trying to do at once. They can get a little tedious over time, and trying to have lots of different types of agenda topics. So you might have some reports, some brainstorming, some decisions, and some selections, so that you're kind of moving through different types of meeting agendas, and you're not making a whole bunch of decisions, or you're not doing a whole bunch of brainstorming, you're not doing a whole bunch of selections, if you can help it. Sometimes it just clusters like that, but the balance helps the group feel effective and like we're all making progress over time. Yeah, and I'll go ahead and take questions because we're going to practice this in breakout groups. So now is a great time for questions to work through how you feel about this and if you have any thoughts.
Keep
Julie?
this on. I might need you to go to the previous. I'm not really sure I'm following clearly, but yeah, we just did this last night in the communication circle of resilient communities, and I didn't feel like we were ready. It's like I think I need to review. I'm not reading this slide, I'm just asking yet. I'm thinking, it's like, what is the navigation role? What is it's like before, it's a very small circle. So like it was difficult to be ready to nominate people for the roles when we weren't actually clear what the tasks and responsibilities of the roles were. So was that slide, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying in the pre-selection process. Like you might have to do several rounds on like, what do we want this role to do? What do we want the term to be? And kind of do that brainstorming as a group before you even get to the selection process. So, and I think that comes with practice. Like as you start to have navigators and secretaries and facilitators in your circle, then it'll kind of like, what that means. Like the group knows what that means. And that's why the training is really important, to just make sure that everyone's on the same page about that. But in lieu of that, as you're getting started, not everybody's going to know. And so it's really important to state like, hey, this is the role, this is the things that they would be doing. Do people understand that? Are there any questions about that? So doing the question round, reaction round, and before you move into the selection process, which is kind of a decision, would be the way to remedy that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about the selection process? I'm also going to put in the chat the slide so that you can look at that while we're in while we're in the breakout rooms. I'll do that. Any other questions? Okay. So here's how the breakout rooms are going to go. So you're going to choose the spokesperson to return to the main group and to share back how your selection process went. So it's a little bit meta in that way. So I think I have a slide here about this specifically. Yes. So you're choosing, the role is the spokesperson to report back to the main group. So in this breakout circle, the facilitator is going to be the person who most recently visited a body of water, unless they really, really, really don't want to do it. And then it can be the person who next most recently visited a body of water. So we're doing that way because we're not going to select multiple roles in this short breakout period of time. We're going to focus on the spokesperson. So remember that you want to do, as a facilitator, the person who has most recently visited a body of water. You're going to do a round of questions. Does everyone understand the role? Then we're going to do a round of nominations. Who do we think would do a good job at this and why? And you might have to do a little round of introductions to figure out like who even has speaking interest, who's interested in speaking, who has qualifications in speaking, and then you might do your nomination round of who do you think would do a good job and why. And then you do the change round based on what you heard. Do you want to change your nomination? And then you tally that up. And I guess you might have someone taking notes as well. Maybe the facilitator can also kind of just keep track of who's nominating who for this purpose. And then at the very end, does everyone consent to this person serving in the role? So consent or object are kind of your options there. And make sure that the person who has been selected as a spokesperson also consents to doing that spokesperson role. And I just want to say you can nominate yourself. If you are like, hey, I'm really interested in being a spokesperson, here's why, that's great. That gives the group a lot of information about like, oh, you're actually really interested in serving in this role. That's great news. That's sometimes the biggest qualification, like the best qualification is someone who wants to do the role. So that's really valuable information to the group. So I have this slide in the chat, so which you should be able to access while you're in the breakout rooms. And I'll kind of move from group to group to just check in on you and see how you're doing. But just to reiterate one more time, your facilitator is the person who most recently visited a body of water. You'll need to talk a little bit about who has any kind of speaking qualifications or who wants to speak. You'll do a nomination round. Who do you think would do a good job and why? You do a change round. You want to change your vote based on what you heard, and a consent round. Do you consent to this person serving as the spokesperson for our group? And you're going to have 15 minutes. You get to try it out, get some practice, and like I said, I'll be popping into various rooms to help you out if you're getting stuck. So, okay, so I'll set up the breakout rooms here. Just give me one moment. All right. Off you go. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully that was interesting as a process. And we'll jump right in with our reflections. So room one, Laurence, Penny, Rick, Victor, who did you nominate as your spokesperson?
We nominated me as the spokesperson. And do I report back to how
Yeah.
the process, what
Yeah,
we
give
went through?
us maybe 1 or 2 minutes of reflection. How did it go for you and your group?
Okay, so the first round we did was who had visited bodies of water recently, and then the facilitator stepped into their role. And then we had some questions about what we were actually reporting back on. So we got to the bottom of those and came to an agreement. And then we talked about our qualifications, about we had a round for that. And then we had a round of nominations. And then we had a round of change, and then we had the consent round. And then we still had some questions on what we were supposed to report back on. And it went really well. It really did. It was a little bit choppy at first because there was no facilitator. You know, we're selecting the facilitator. But once that hurdle was crossed, it just flowed. It went really, really well. And I'm inspired.
Well, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I should have made it more clear that they'd be reporting back on how the process went to the group. But thank you for figuring that out. That was a good, excuse to do a round of questions. So anyone else from your group want to add anything about how that process went? Any reflections? Yeah, Penny?
I think one thing we found out during the nomination round is that we could have expanded a little more on why we were nominating the person, so that then we would have more to talk about in the change round, like so that each we could because we just basically nominated the person but didn't say why, other than that we had already known. But just in general, like when you're really in a meeting, it would be good to really explain why you're nominating the person.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that in. And room 2. So it's Dave, Emmanuel, Liz, and Sophia. Who did you nominate as spokesperson?
So I got nominated for this one. It feels like a similar experience to what Victor was saying before. Initially, when we were trying to get started, it was pretty messy trying to figure out because we weren't aligned on what's the structure of how do we get going. But we talked it out, worked it out on what the body of water, and then selecting the facilitator, and then going from there. There were still some questions on exactly the rounds and how those are specifically implemented and how do we go. But we worked through them. And we did an initial round of nominations. And we kind of naturally fell into giving like a little bit of explanation of why we chose the person. And then we went through a changed round, and everybody ended up sticking with their same votes. And then the consent round. And there were a couple questions on the consent round. How it came through, it felt like to me was everybody just like confirming, everybody except the nominee confirming their existing vote or changing it if they decided it happened. People just stuck with their same vote, and then it felt like for the person being nominated. Was what if they consent to like accepting the nomination or not, not necessarily as like they're voting. So there's where the final voting happens. I think it was a question that came up for our group. And one other thing I'll add. A few other things. Well, I'll add one more for right now. If somebody has like a concern that they bring out of like a person being nominated from like months ago, does that person have an opportunity then to reflect or defend themselves, or however we want to phrase that, through additional rounds? And what does that process look like? I'll stop there.
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, so the consent round is for everybody, including the nominee, and that is the vote, quote unquote. So yeah, that's the moment where the nominee might say like, I don't have time to do this, or I don't have interest in this, or I don't. That's when you would say that, and you treat it like you would treat an objection. So you kind of maybe ask some questions. You could even do a reaction round, and you could treat it like an objection, especially if there's something that comes up that's like, oh, I object because of this thing that happened 3 months ago with this person. Then you might have to treat it like an objection, like, okay, I want to ask some questions about that. How does everyone feel about that? Or you might need to take that into kind of an offline conflict mediation process. But ideally, there's not things that are coming out of nowhere, right? Because we're doing like meeting feedback and review regularly. So for sake of time, I think if anyone else from Dave's group wants to offer reflections, throwing them in the chat. And I'm going to move to room 3. So Joan, Michelle, Pamela, and Saher. And who did you nominate as spokesperson?
I was nominated as the spokesperson. And so Michelle did an amazing job facilitating. She was the one that was closest to the body of water. So that part went fairly quickly and smoothly. And then the nomination process was interesting. I raised a concern about why I was hesitant to be spokesperson, and it ended up coming to fruition, which was my concern when you're a spokesperson for a breakout room is that you don't really go through what you're going to say, and that something important gets missed. And so I appreciate, Andra, that you're giving the opportunity for others in the group to speak, because I think then that's covered off. And for us, it worked out that I was nominated. There was one other person nominated, but they decided they didn't want to take on the role. And I guess my question was, what if there's 2 people nominated? Like, doesn't the group have to all accept and I don't know what happens then. I was a little bit lost on the process there.
Yeah, so if two people are nominated, if it's kind of a split vote, that's okay because you still get to do the consent round. So it's like, okay, this person had the most nominations. Does everyone feel like that's good enough for now and safe enough to try? So the objection is, so the nomination is the preference and the consent is that range of tolerance, right? So if it's outside of your range of tolerance, then you can say, oh, no, object. I can't see this person serving in this role. But if it's still in your range of tolerance, then you can move forward with that initial nomination, even if it's not everybody's preference. So that's a great piece of review. Thank you for that. Beautiful. Thank you, Joan. And inviting anyone from Joan's group to type in the chat if there's anything that you feel like got missed. And yeah, this is also a great moment to say that with your delegate and your navigator who are going and being your spokesperson for the next circle up, you're really trusting them, right? You're trusting them to collect the most relevant feedback and bring that. And that's why you want to have two people so that things don't get missed in that communication process. So thanks for bringing that up. And moving into group 4, Angie, Elias, Julie, and Kim, who is your spokesperson?
Me. Yeah. I'm not sure I was the best nominee because what do I focus on? Anyway, so I was like nervous we'd run out of time, and I got actually voted for my enthusiasm. So my nervousness is like why I got this job. Anyway, so yeah, so I quickly said I think I immediately dove in with, I just visited my body of water yesterday, which is like my little short walk from my house. So I didn't know if it was time or distance. I'm hearing distance for the first time. Anyway, so, I said, is that right? Is everybody consenting to, me being the facilitator? And then both of the other two people slowed down. It was great. Elias had, sort of a better idea of what we were doing. So both Kim and I leaned on him for that. So he slowed us down and said, I think we should go around and talk about our bodies of water, which was very interesting because of the where. Elias is the Mediterranean Sea and Kim is her body and the earth. It's like, wow. Anyway, but yeah, so I ended up being the facilitator. And we got to lean on Elias as if he was the person who created the agenda because he sort of got the whole what we were doing best of the three of us. So what else? Anything relevant that I'm pretending I'm going back to the main group? Yeah, I think we went through the rounds well. There was some change in nominations. We all got nominated, and then Kim was tempted by my wanting to nominate Elias, who nominated me. Anyway, it was like all three of us got nominated, but then she sent Kim was like, for the sake of like getting this job done, I'll stick with my original vote of Julie. So that's how it happened. We went through it was just like the other groups. The nomination was like, we were like, what are we doing in the beginning? And then going through the change and the consent, and yeah, it all worked. It was kind of, I was operating on the fly as sort of the facilitator from the beginning, and it worked well.
Great, thank you.
This is an amazing experience, I have to say. I was like, we should do this more often as part of my anyway.
Yeah, and a good example of like maybe since Julie was facilitator and also spokesperson, like could have divvied up those roles, but that's also okay. It can double up. So, and then room 5, Adrian, Jim, Karen, Maria, Elena. Last little reflection here.
So I was nominated to be the spokesperson, and Karen was our facilitator. She did really well. Everybody in the group was a little bit hesitant, was my feeling about the process at first, but actually it went super well. We got through all of the rounds pretty quickly. Our first round, well, we did the bodies of water and figured out who was going to facilitate very quickly. And then Karen took us through a short round of introductions. Then we went to nominations, and we did the whys right away, but they were quite short whys. And we ended up with 3 people being nominated. 2 people had 1 nomination, and I had 2 nominations. So then we went into consent, and what I was telling my group is at that point, I felt a little bit like we were in a democracy and we had just voted me in. And I was wondering whether I liked that. So I felt like I was being voted in to take on this role. And then I realized that when we went into the consent round, that actually I could object. So it felt better at that point, and I decided to consent. But it was interesting just kind of going, wait a minute, how did I get voted in to do this? So yeah, that was interesting, the difference between a democracy and sociocracy. And then we finished early, so we did a round of, just how did this feel to everyone, and everybody spoke about their points. Generally, they were good. There was a little bit of confusion by some around the purpose of the role, what it was exactly that we were going to be reporting back on. So that got clarified throughout the rounds. We didn't actually do a round of clarification. And I think that's it. I don't know. I hope I haven't forgotten anything, but I think that's it.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, those great reflections. And yeah, if you have more thoughts on this process or more questions about this process or anything from the presentation today, please put them in the space and I can answer them there since we're out of time for today. But I do just want to share a quick slide of our key takeaways from today. So if you're like, what did we even do? You can come back to this. So we talked about the meeting roles consisting of the facilitator, navigator, secretary, and delegate. We talked about objections being the whole group's responsibility, not just the facilitators, but really inviting that into a round for feedback. And then feedback is how we learn. So thinking about the feedback at the end of the meeting, thinking about performance review feedback, thinking about circle-wide feedback, that meta-level feedback, and yeah, even you can do organizational feedback loops. So thinking about how we iterate over time and getting that feedback from your groups so that you're evolving and changing and tweaking the structure to make sure that it's working for people over time. So that's it for today. I do want to remind everyone we don't have class next Monday, but we will come back on I believe it is the 9th of February. So it'll be the 9th and the 16th for our last 2 classes. So you get a 2-week break to kind of simmer on this. And yeah. I will stay in case there's any extra questions, but I'll go ahead and end the recording. Thank you so much, everybody. And if you have any feedback on this presentation, please put it on the space. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.
Thank you all. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea.